Welcome to the Lebanon Ideas Forum video series featuring politicians, activists, entrepreneurs, civil society leaders, and members and leaders from across the diaspora. Today's guest is Ambassador Ed Gabriel, who is currently President and CEO of the American Task Force for Lebanon, ATFL, also former ambassador to Morocco, amongst many other positions he's held in the international arena. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador Gabriel, to talk all things Lebanon, present and future.
Thank you for the opportunity to meet with you.
So, Ambassador Gabriel, tomorrow is June 15th. We're basically a month out of the parliamentary elections in Lebanon that took place last month. There have been various readouts of the results. Where are we today, a month after the elections? So,
I think there's good news combined with some not so great news. The good news is that the opposition figures won more handily than we expected. I don't think anyone thought that the opposition candidates would win so many seats. Looks like they've got a solid 13 seats. There are another 5 opposition figures that have been re-elected to parliament. And then there are, opposition groups like the Lebanese forces that gained seats. When you add up all the opposition figures that should be together on any issue, they do form the majority. So there was a lot of optimism initially coming out of the elections, and it was based on some pessimism going into it. When we were there with a delegation in March, we met with all the opposition leaders, and we came home a little worried that they weren't coordinating their functions and were actually competing with one another in various election districts throughout Lebanon. That came true on April 5th when they announced their lists. And it was too bad because I think they could have won many more seats. But that competition among them seems to continue. They're having a hard time coming together on issues, forming coalitions, etc. But they're talking and they're moving in the right direction, and they care overall about the big issues. And that is, getting rid of corruption, addressing the needs of the Lebanese people, turning around the economic crisis, making sure that Hezbollah does not have an outsized reputation or responsibility in the country, and doing away with corruption. And hopefully lessening Hezbollah's influence. So that's the good news. But when you look at the committee structures which have been formed in the last few weeks, you can also see kind of a divergence of positions throughout the committees. So I don't think any single committee is going to dominate the discussion in its area, whether it be energy or governance or infrastructure development or social welfare. So it's going to be a continual struggle. And that's kind of where they are. It's kind of a 50-50 Senate, as we would say in America. It's kind of a 50-50 parliament. And they're going to have to find compromise and coalitions in order to move ahead. Maybe they'll find a lot of compromise and coalition on issues more than just forming blocks.
So you talked about some of these major issues that should be a priority for many of these newly elected MPs. What do you believe is the priority issue that all of the members of parliament cannot afford to diverge from?
Well, I think you and I both know that it's the economic crisis, and that leads to social disruption. So what they've got in their country is now approaching an 80% poverty rate. They've gone from a middle income country in a few short years to one of the 5 worst economic countries in the world. The World Bank recently said that Lebanon was one of the 4 worst economic disasters since the mid 1850s. That's alarming when you think about it. So fixing the economic mess, stopping the hurt and the pain and the suffering in Lebanon through an economic program has to take priority. The only way to do that is to come up with an IMF plan that the people and the IMF both agreed to. When we were there in March, we were there exactly at the time that the IMF staff came. We met with all the leaders, and we witnessed the leadership coming together on a staff agreement with the IMF. So again, another positive development. The question is, can now the staff plan be turned into a real complete plan that will address the needs of the people? So they're going to need to, the Parliament's going to need to enact 4 or 5 or 6 very difficult actions in order for the IMF to then get their board approval to shake you loose several $billion in immediate aid. Some people think they can get that done by the end of the year. Most people are very pessimistic that the Parliament will take tough decisions, which answers your question. Those are the tough decisions they're going to have to take in order to turn the situation around. So that's number one.
Mm-hmm. So because these are really tough decisions to make politically, particularly for those who represents factions or have been representing the same factions for decades, how do you think this will happen? I mean, it seems that there will be multiple deadlocks along the way, but there's also an urgency in addressing these pressing economic and financial conditions in order to at least start the rehabilitation process and lift people up from where they're descending further and further into poverty.
So more good news, I think, slightly good news. The Biden administration has not lost its focus on Lebanon. We've got a very competent ambassador, Dorothy Shea, in Lebanon, who's empowered to really represent the U.S. interests there. The United States is in agreement with France, the Gulf countries, and other countries that care so much about Lebanon, with the central focus being fixing the economic mess, but not giving money away to a government that's corrupt and will not face reforms. So in one sense, the unified position of the world community that cares about Lebanon has been a positive factor in really pushing the factions in Lebanon together to face up to their dilemma. We see more and more the 3 presidents, the head of the parliament, head of government, and the head of state, coming together and making decisions, for instance, to agree on the IMF staff plan. They came to agreement and did that. There seems to be movement on the maritime border issue just this week. Again, U.S. envoy Hochstein is there, and there seems to be some positive elements coming together. And that's because the pressure by the U.S. and its allies and its determination to stick to its guns and say, look, we're not bailing you out unless you do reforms. So that has helped a great deal with the unified message and pressure. Is it good enough? We don't know. The alternative is the following, and we say this to the Lebanese. By the end of the year, if they don't have an IMF plan, by the end of the year or the first quarter of next year, they will be a failed state. They'll be in bankruptcy. So then they'll be a welfare state. They'll basically be a state in which they need humanitarian aid like any other poor country in the world that is struggling to feed its people. And it's only going to get worse. So that's the alternative to them making some of these tough decisions. We can only hope that the pressure will bear on them to take some of these decisions. Again, if they can agree on this new energy deal of providing Jordanian electricity and Egyptian gas through Syria to Lebanon, close on the maritime border, those will start to show the international community that they're making decisions. They need to pass some of the other laws, though, in support of the IMF.
So speaking of some of these projects / agreements that are sort of, pending, I spoke to the Jordanian Minister of Finance a few weeks ago and asked him about where this electricity deal is. And his response was that everything is ready. It's just a matter of literally switching on the lights, and that the obstacle is one that is a political one. So where is this political obstacle coming from?
Well, I was more clear in my understanding of it a week ago than I am today, but let me tell you where I think it is. For a while, the Lebanese had not closed contracts with Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. Those have been completed post-Ramadan. They've been completed. It's come back to the United States. The United States has basically said as soon as we get these contracts, they're going straight to the World Bank for approval so the financing can go forward. It's our understanding that it's now at the World Bank for approval. However, the United States, under pressure from the Congress, is asking for very specific understandings of how the money will be spent and given out to the various countries for various issues, because no money should go to Syria. Yeah. Syria will get some in-kind contribution from electricity for the lines going through there, but it'll be very small. But they want to make sure that the money doesn't end up in corrupt hands, and that the gas going into Syria is the same gas coming out of Syria, same quantities, and electricity. So the United States, under pressure from Congress, has asked those questions now. But I agree with the Jordanian ambassador if she said that they're ready just to pull the levers. I thought that a month ago. I still believe that we're just a week or two away.
Let's hope that's the case, because as you said, that will certainly contribute to easing some of the pressures on the population. So you mentioned Congress, and I know that ATFL does a lot of work on the Hill to highlight Lebanon, to ensure that Lebanon stays in the conversation, that it is part of what the Biden administration is working on in the region. Can you talk a little bit more about your role and the work that you are leading with ATFL?
Sure. I would start by saying that the former Lebanese ambassador to America once called ATFL his secret weapon. Dorothy Shea recently said ATFL is our best soft power tool. I think the diaspora of the United States, the Lebanese diaspora, Lebanese Americans living in the United States, have been a formidable force in expressing their opinions to Congress. Through ATFL, yes, but they've been very active individually, not only with humanitarian aid, which exceeded $50 million the last 2 years by the Lebanese American community, but in really getting members of Congress to understand the Lebanon situation, to become friends with them, and to make sure that they don't forget Lebanon. They have a caucus on the Hill, the U.S. Lebanon Friendship Caucus. It has 30-some members now, which is an all-time high. And there are a lot of people associated with Lebanese around the country. Some are married, Senator Menendez's wife is Lebanese. So we have somebody whispering in his ear on a regular basis to not forget Lebanon. We have Lebanese American members of Congress, Charlie Crist, Darren LaHood, Darrell Issa, and others like Debbie Dingell and other members of Congress across the country that have a connection to the Lebanese in Lebanon. And in that sense, last year, Congress basically allocated, when you can count all the monies up, $600 million in US aid went to Lebanon, making it the fourth largest recipient of US aid by the United States, which is quite a statement for such a small country. So it's going well. It's a great balance. Whether they're Democrat or Republican, they seem to come together on Lebanon. There are little quirks that we have to work on. And there's this Hezbollah question constantly that we have to make sure is fully appreciated and understood, how we deal with Hezbollah. For instance, one last point, we support very heavily the Lebanese armed forces, which is keeping the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country together. It's the best institution there is. DOD loves the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces. But many members of Congress want to know that money to the LAF don't go into the hands of Hezbollah. So we're constantly ensuring that and making sure the Lebanese understand that they have to have good accounting, and Lebanese Armed Forces has to have good accounting. And we trust that institution. I should say the rest of the money that we talk about does not go to Lebanese government. It goes directly through institutions, multilateral and civil society, directly to Lebanese people.
So my question was going to be about the big elephant in the room in any discussion with regards to Lebanon, which is Hezbollah, and you've just addressed it. But it seems that that is pretty much the only topic that brings Lebanon back to the headlines. Otherwise, it's constantly, as you said, trying to keep it relevant and keep the support flowing to the Lebanese armed forces and the economic assistance as well. Now, the Biden administration has also prioritized the resuscitation, if you will, of the Iran nuclear agreement. And while things are on hold right now, this is certainly, giving Iran more time and perhaps empowering them, which might reflect on how Hezbollah and other Iranian-supported groups in the region act, particularly after what many people saw as a defeat in the elections. So how do you navigate through these convoluted corridors when you're on the Hill, trying to, on the one hand, prioritize support for the LAF and economic reforms and economic assistance to the Lebanese people, but at the same time, you have other more pressing national security issues that are related to Iran's influence in the region?
That's a great question with many parts. So first, let me say the elephant in the room for us is Hezbollah and corruption. And when the two come together, it's terrible. And when they team up politically, they can cause trouble. So we've got to deal with corruption on the one hand, I believe, because I think it's in the U.S. interest, and Hezbollah on the other. If Lebanon becomes a failed state on the northern border of Israel, it's not in the U.S. interest. To have a failed state on the eastern border of the Med, north of Israel, and having Iran benefit from a failed state. So I think there's tremendous U.S. and especially with Russia, Ukraine now situation. We could talk about that, but we really have to make sure that the United States is putting its foot down and saying, look, enough's enough. And we're going to stand by our friends in the region. So I think in that sense, we've got to take this problem in Lebanon pretty seriously. So to move to kind of the Iran equation, I would say that we support a JCPOA because it's in America's interest, and we're Americans of Lebanese ancestry. And that's the way we like to present ourselves. Some of us are second and third generation. Some have never been to Lebanon, but care a great deal about their homeland of their ancestors. So we think like Americans, and we believe a JCPOA properly negotiated is in the best interest of the United States. The problem is we're also saying, you made a promise, President Biden. You said you're going to make it longer and stronger. And that means longer in terms of time period, but stronger in terms of going after missile technology and terrorism proxies. That means Hezbollah. What we're hearing back is, well, we got to deal with the nuclear question first, and then we'll get to that. Well, we're concerned about that, and so are a number of our allies in the Gulf. Israel's concerned about that, and so are certain members of Congress. So we're working very hard to make sure that there's a follow-on process to any negotiations on JCPOA. Having said that, just to get to JCPOA is going to be a real challenge. So you can see we juggle with that. We advocate very strongly in that regard. But you're right. I think you, Merissa, you hit the nail on the head with this one. To fix the Iranian problem once and for all on some kind of a deal would really help in a lot of problems in the region. President Biden's going to Saudi next month. We agree with Saudi that they shouldn't throw money at Lebanon, at the Lebanese government. We are trying to encourage Saudi, though, and the other Gulf states to help the universities from failing, civil society, hospitals, the refugees. There's so much and they can go through UN agencies to help the poor people. There's so much they can do. So we're encouraging them to do that. But we're in agreement with them when it comes to a hard line on the government. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did, absolutely. And you mentioned President Biden's upcoming trip next month to the region. So if you had 5 minutes with the president to give him one key message on Lebanon, what would it be?
Don't forget Lebanon, and realize that wherever you go in the region, you're going to hear about Lebanon. And you don't want under your administration to have not paid attention to a country that may become a failed state. We have to make sure it doesn't under your watch. You can do that with your allies in the Gulf by encouraging them to do things that we've just talked about, and making sure that there's a coalition of the willing to pull together to make this work.
And this coalition of the willing includes the regional allies as well as European allies.
European, Gulf, and across the region as well. Jordan, Egypt, all the way to Morocco. There are things that the regional countries can do to be supportive together, like I said before, in common, with a common policy, to really get the government to face up to the fact that they're not going to get bailed out unless they do the right thing for the people.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Gabriel, for your time and for your insight. And we look forward to continuing the discussion with you and your colleagues at ATFL on all things Lebanon in the next few months. And we will see you soon. Thank you for your time. Thank you.